Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, July 1st, 2024. All right, so I am back from vacation and I have very good, exciting news to talk about. For a change, which I'm sure you're all aware of this news, is that Julian Assange is free. He's actually home in Australia. He actually arrived in Australia when I was still there, which is just, it was pretty amazing to see this all go down, just happen so quickly. The first story I saw was the NBC News, I think, that broke the story that he reached a plea deal that would secure his freedom. And then WikiLeaks confirmed it. So again, I'm sure you're all well aware of this. This is kind of old news now, even though it wasn't that long ago. But the one thing I wanted to discuss, we'll get into some other stuff that happened while I was away. And if people are interested, I'll talk about the trip a bit at the end. I know there's a lot of Australians that listen and watch this show. But the one thing I wanted to talk about with Assange is it seemed to be there's a lot of confusion for people over whether or not this set a legal precedent. And it's kind of confusing because it did not technically set a legal precedent, but you could say that this plea deal set a precedent in the sense that the U.S. government might try to do this to a journalist again. But when it comes to a legal binding precedent that future court rulings would have to abide by, there was not a precedent set by that. So the plea deal was essentially Assange agreed to plead guilty to one charge under the Espionage Act. And the U.S., gave him a 5-year sentence, which he served already in Belmarsh prison. And then counting the time that he was at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, he was locked up essentially for 14 years. And then the 5 years in Belmarsh, very brutal conditions, essentially solitary confinement. Most of the time there. So anyway, the plea deal was he agreed to plead guilty to one charge under the Espionage Act, and he was free to go home. But the U.S. did get the guilty plea. So it is bad in the sense that they criminalized journalism. That's what happened here. He shouldn't have had to do that. That's why we should continue to push for a pardon of Julian Assange. But my friend Pat McFarlane, who's a writer for the Libertarian Institute, he has a podcast called Vital Dissent. He did a show, he's a lawyer, and he did a show explaining the legal precedent. We have a quote here from Consortium News. They quoted Bruce Afrin, who's a U.S. constitutional lawyer, discussing the idea, basically saying that a plea does not set a legal precedent. So I'll just read that. He said, quote, "A plea is not a precedent. Precedent consists of a decision interpreting a matter of law by an appeals court that will govern future cases on the same legal principle. In contrast, a plea is merely a factual agreement by a given defendant that they did a certain act, but does not bind future defendants in similar cases. For example, if Julian chooses to drop his First Amendment defenses and plead guilty, this does not mean that a similar defendant in the future does not have a First Amendment defense in an Espionage Act case. No appeals court has decided such issues, and Julian's plea does not bind future courts or future parties, nor will it ever be considered in any other defendant's case." So essentially, a precedent, the way for a precedent to be set, and this is the example that Pat used in his show, say the U.S., say this thing went to trial, Assange was extradited, it went to trial, and the court ruled that he does not have, his activity is not protected under the First Amendment. Now, say Assange's legal team appealed that decision, then it would go to an appeals court, and whatever they ruled would set the precedent, whether they sided with the U.S. government or not. And let's say that happened. Let's say an appeals court did rule that what Assange did, which is journalism, was not protected by the First Amendment. That would set a precedent. That would have been basically the worst case scenario, and if Assange was locked away for life. But that didn't happen. So this is good news, and we can celebrate it. It's not the best case scenario. The best case would have been him to be free, for none of this to ever happen. But this is what happened. And, this is the result of pressure. What really seems to have turned the tide. We have an article from Kevin Gosztola on his website, The Dissenter. And it explains, Assange's lawyers said that the thing that really changed here, these talks, kind of informal talks between Assange's legal team and the Department of Justice, were kind of going on for a long time, but they weren't really going anywhere until May, when the British High Court ruled that Assange could appeal the extradition to the U.S. on the grounds that he might not have First Amendment protections in the U.S. That sped things up, and they were ready to make a deal. Other things that led to this is the pressure, both from activists, all of you who have contacted your congressmen, people, all activists in Australia, and the Australian government. According to Assange's lawyers, Kevin Rudd, who is the Australian ambassador to the U.S., he was appointed pretty recently. He has really been pushing the case, and he met with Assange in the North Mariana Islands. So that was another part of the deal, is that Assange didn't want to go to the continental United States. So he went to the North Mariana Islands. I almost say marinara, but the North Mariana Islands to plead guilty. He saw a judge there. So Kevin Rudd met him there. It goes to show he was a part of this deal. And he's a former Australian prime minister. And I actually read one of his books recently about China, about how the U.S. and China shouldn't go to war. He's pretty good. He's kind of a liberal, rules-based order believer, but he seems to be one of the better ones. But anyway, so where was I with this? The pressure from the Australian government. We saw an Australian parliamentary delegation. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, finally started speaking out again for Assange. So all that seemed to have worked. So again, read Kevin Gosztola. He was just interviewed by Scott Horton for more details about the case. He's very good with that. But this is just really great news. Another reason why. So again, back to the appeal. The British court ruled that Assange could appeal the extradition, so that motivated the U.S. to reach a deal with him instead. Another motive, I think, was that even if he was extradited, if the court ruled he could be extradited, that would happen quickly, as far as I understand it, and they wouldn't want to be putting a journalist on trial right before the November election. Would not be a good look for Biden. So I think that was part of it as well. So again, just really great to see. And just the fact that I was in Australia for it was very cool. I was in Sydney. He landed in Canberra, the capital, which isn't too far from Sydney, but we were leaving, pretty much the next day. Our flight was canceled, so we pushed it back a day. If I knew that was going to happen, I might have made the trip there for the press conference. But just a really historical, great thing. And other details of the plea deal. WikiLeaks, apparently, they agreed to destroy classified documents that they had, which they had not made public yet. So if they had any of those, they destroyed them. There's no gag order on Assange, so he can do whatever, what he wants after this, and it'll be interesting to see what he does. I don't think we should have any expectations of him. He's done enough. He should spend time with his family, with his wife and kids. But I think anything he does, he'll have the ability to do some powerful things if he wants, even if it's just like, returning to Twitter or something and voicing his opinion about things. I think that could go a long way. But just very good news. I'm sure there's details that I'm missing here, but I didn't want to go over too much since, again, you're all already well aware of this. Some other big news that happened while I was gone. I thought this was interesting. I pulled this article up from Kyle Anzalone that he wrote on June 19th. So Kyle did a whole ton of work while I was gone. Connor Freeman, Will Porter also did a lot of writing in my absence. Jason Ditz did extra. So these guys really did a lot of work. Antiwar.com is great. When I was on vacation, I was checking it every day just to keep up, and it's such a good resource. I mean, that's basically all I had to do was read antiwar.com to stay abreast of all the foreign policy. I listened to a few episodes of Kyle's show, Conflicts of Interest, a few Scott Horton interviews, and I stayed pretty caught up, pretty on top of things. One thing I thought that was interesting. Again, this is on June 19th. The spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, he said on Israeli TV that Netanyahu's goal of eliminating Hamas is unachievable. He said, quote, "This business of destroying Hamas, making Hamas disappear, it's simply throwing sand in the eyes of the public. Hamas is an idea. Hamas is a party. It's rooted in the hearts and minds of the people. Whoever thinks we can eliminate Hamas is wrong." So, end quote. So that is the head, he's not the head of the IDF, but that's the IDF spokesman saying that the prime minister's goal in Gaza is unachievable. We've seen U.S. officials say this, yet they continue to support this thing. And unfortunately, in my absence, I was hoping something good would happen related to Gaza. I was hoping there would be a ceasefire while I was gone. I ended up getting a free Julian Assange, which is great, but unfortunately, the situation in Gaza is still horrific, and there's no sign that the talks or a ceasefire is going to happen anytime soon. The death toll is approaching 38,000. That's the death toll that's released by the health ministry in Gaza, and unfortunately, it's probably much higher than that. So, we have some stories about Gaza today, but I just thought that was interesting. Other things that happened, U.S. provided ATACMS cluster bombs, killed civilians on the beach in Crimea, and Russia has vowed that it would respond. So just a consequence of providing these types of weapons. It's definitely a concern what Russia might do in response. There's some other things I'll kind of pepper in that have happened since I was gone. But again, we should all celebrate the release of Julian Assange, push for his pardon, take it as a win. I remember in November, I think it was 2022, when I went to Washington, D.C., and I spoke at the Assange rally outside of the DOJ. It was a great event. Everybody, tons of great speakers, lots of really good energy, but maybe it was just a feeling that I had. There was kind of just a vibe of hopelessness almost. Maybe it was just me and whatever, and I went to, actually the last time we went to Australia in 2020, we went to a Free Assange rally in Sydney, and that was cool to do in Australia. And again, at the time, I remember, and just overall covering the case, and you guys here have heard me cover it on this show, usually pretty negative, pretty pessimistic. So again, to see this, I was just like, it was just unbelievable. And to see Assange, he's looking good. He hasn't spoke yet really, but the videos of him getting on, it's just incredible to see. So just really good news. But now we're going to get into the news that I wrote up on Sunday and what's going on this week. And unfortunately, this news is not very good. So we'll get into that. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Ukraine wants NATO-imposed no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. So Ukrainian officials are pushing NATO countries to impose a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine using air defense systems in Eastern Europe, a step that would mean direct NATO involvement in the war with Russia. So Alexei Goncharenko, who's a Ukrainian lawmaker, told AFP, quote, "I don't understand why NATO doesn't deploy Patriot systems along the Polish border. After all, Russian missiles have already entered Polish and Romanian airspace. This would protect the borders of Poland and Romania, and this would create a safe zone in the west and south of Ukraine," end quote. So the idea is for NATO to protect Ukrainian industry and energy infrastructure in the western portion of the country. But a no-fly zone would require NATO to shoot down Russian missiles and potentially Russian aircraft. Russian planes haven't been flying in western Ukraine, but there's always the chance that they could. And that's what imposing a no-fly zone means, is shooting down planes, shooting down missiles, and also destroying the things that are sending missiles there. That could be part of it as well. And the direct NATO involvement, of course, just makes war, NATO-Russia war, more likely, makes nuclear war more likely, just completely an escalation that should be unimaginable. But despite this huge risk of escalation, Ukraine's Western backers appear to be entertaining the idea of a no-fly zone. A European diplomatic source told AFP that talks about the issue were in progress, adding that it was not a simple decision. So if you remember, in the early days of the war, back in 2022, Zelensky was pushing for a U.S. and NATO-imposed no-fly zone over all of Ukraine, but he backed off on that demand as it received very little support. It got some support from some of the real ultra-hawks, some of the real crazies in Washington, but for the most part, it didn't get much support. But then in May, recently, he began calling for NATO to shoot down Russian missiles and downplayed the risk of nuclear escalation. He says, shoot them down. It's not a big deal. Come on. So I haven't seen any indication yet that the U.S. is considering this, but we have, some of these European countries have been very belligerent when it comes to this war. The Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, and Poland. Hopefully they don't actually go through with this or really seriously consider it. But the fact that this is something Ukraine is asking for is very concerning. All right, so the next one here, Putin says that Russia should make previously banned missile systems. So on Friday, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia should follow the U.S. in developing missile systems that were previously banned under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. That's the INF, which the U.S. withdrew from in 2019. The INF prohibited land-based missile systems with a range between 310 and 3,400 miles. After leaving the treaty, the U.S. immediately began developing and testing batteries that could fire nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of about 1,000 miles and are primarily used by U.S. Navy ships and submarines. So I remember in August 2019 when they pulled out of this treaty, it was like that same month the U.S. was test firing these missile systems. So Putin said on Friday, quote, "We need to start production of these strike systems and then, based on the actual situation, make decisions about where, if necessary, to ensure our safety, to place them," end quote. So the U.S. recently deployed one of its new previously banned missile systems for exercises in the Philippines. The missile system, known as the Typhoon launcher, is concealed in a 40-foot shipping container and can fire Tomahawks and SM-6 missiles, which can hit targets up to 290 miles away, which is below the levels previously banned by the INF, but it can also fire the Tomahawks. The U.S. has previously deployed this system and the U.S. Navy's variant of it for exercises in Denmark, which I was not aware of until I saw this story. Putin said, quote, "Today it is known that the United States not only produces these missile systems, but it has already brought them to Europe for exercises to Denmark. Quite recently, it was announced that they are in the Philippines," end quote. When the U.S. withdrew from the INF Treaty, it claimed that Russia was violating the agreement by developing the ground-launched 9M729 cruise missile. So it was a new cruise missile that Russia was making. Russian officials denied that it violated the treaty, saying that it had a maximum range of 298 miles. From what I understand from arms control experts, there was some real concerns about these missiles, but the U.S. didn't try to address them. They just made the accusation and they pulled out of the treaty, and that was that. And Russia also accused the U.S. of, there was real accusations that the U.S. might have been violating the treaty as well by establishing Aegis Ashore missile defense systems in Romania and Poland. They use launchers that are used on U.S. Navy destroyers that can fit Tomahawk missiles. So there was a real potential violation on the U.S. side as well. Instead of negotiating this issue, the Trump administration pulled out of the treaty, tore it up, and started testing these missile systems. And because it was clear, because we basically had Trump administration officials saying this at the time, that they were getting out of this treaty because they wanted to develop these missiles so they can deploy them near China. Since that was clear, Russia offered the U.S. a moratorium on the deployment of these missiles in Europe, but the U.S. never accepted the offer, never really engaged with that offer. So just another story about just showing how the state of arms control is in a very sorry state between the U.S. and Russia. The next one here, Russia threatens U.S. drones in Black Sea aiding attacks on Crimea. This one's from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. In response to Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean Peninsula, tensions between the U.S. and Russia have significantly escalated, with Moscow threatening U.S. drones operating over the Black Sea. The Kremlin says that the drones are part of the Ukrainian operations in the region, and when they're using things like ATACMS missiles, the U.S. gives Ukraine, coordinates, intelligence and stuff for those strikes. So it's possible that the drones are collecting some of that data that they give to Ukraine. So on Friday, the Russian Defense Ministry said that there had been an uptick in American drone operations in the Black Sea, carrying out reconnaissance of the Crimean Peninsula. The statement explained that the Russian military was instructed to prepare an operational response to the flights. The remarks followed a Ukrainian attack using U.S. cluster munitions that caused the death of 4 civilians and wounded hundreds of others, and that was on the beach in Crimea. Moscow argues that Washington's support for Kiev makes the U.S. effectively a party to the conflict. So again, more warnings about Russia responding to these things. And there was a U.S. MQ-9 drone downed over the Black Sea, I think last year, after an encounter with a Russian plane. So this sounds like they might be talking about something like just outright shooting the drones down. And, that is a potential response to all these escalations that wouldn't involve, American troops being killed, but would involve Russia taking a clear military action against the U.S. So maybe a possibility. All right, the next one here, the U.S. has sent Israel 14,000 2,000-pound bombs. So Reuters reported on Saturday that the U.S. has given Israel a massive number of heavy munitions since October 7th, including 14,000 of the highly destructive Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs that have been repeatedly dropped on civilians in Gaza. 2 U.S. officials told Reuters that the U.S. has also sent 6,500 500-pound bombs, 3,000 Hellfire missiles, 1,000 bunker buster bombs, 2,600 small-diameter bombs, and other munitions. The large number of munitions demonstrate the fact that the Biden administration's pause on one shipment of powerful bombs did not have any real impact on U.S. military support for Israel. Really just a PR move to make it look like Biden was doing something. But, I mean, when you give them 14,000 of these huge bombs, more than any of the other ones, I mean, that's a very big supply. Israel has plenty of them. Axios reported on June 27th that the U.S. has approved the transfer of 1,700 500-pound bombs that were part of this shipment that was paused. So they're already going to send some of that paused bomb shipment. So an administration official told reporters last week that the U.S. has provided Israel with $6.5 billion worth of weapons since October 7th to support the slaughter and starvation of Palestinians in Gaza. The administration has vowed Israel will receive all of the $17 billion in additional military aid that was included in the $95 billion bill President Biden signed into law in April. So despite this massive support, something else that happened while I was gone, Netanyahu accused the U.S. of withholding military aid. And this claim the White House called inaccurate. So he actually did this. He put out a video. This was a public accusation. It seems to be part of maybe his domestic political strategy, kind of making it out like the U.S. isn't giving him everything he needs to get things done in Gaza. So what did the U.S. do in response? Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, he visited Washington last week, and U.S. officials worked to assure him that they were doing everything they could to get Israel all the weapons that it wants. So he had meetings with U.S. officials and said, we discussed some of the things like the bottlenecks, the obstacles removed to military aid shipments, and they're working on it. And I'm happy. Essentially, like logistical things that might slow things down. And while he was in Washington, Gallant said that Israel's ties with the U.S. were the second most important element for Israel's security, saying that U.S. support is second only to Israel's military. It's the most important thing besides the actual military itself. He said, quote, "We need American diplomatic and political support, power projection, supply of munition, and more," end quote. So this is why, this slaughter, this genocidal war in Gaza, completely being enabled by and supported by the U.S. government, why Americans like me should oppose it so strongly. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. military again removes Pier from Gaza coast due to weather. The U.S. military has again removed the pier it built off the coast of Gaza due to seas that it cannot handle, and the floating structure will be towed to the Israeli port of Ashdod. The Pentagon announced this on Friday. So this is the third time this has happened. The first time it was actually damaged due to heavy seas. The second time this happened while I was gone, there was some more rough weather, and so they dismantled it and towed it into port. And then now, so this is the third time. And the reason why they have to keep doing this, it's a pier. We've been calling it a pier. It's a temporary pier, but it's really a floating dock. I mean, a pier kind of implies that it's like a fixed structure, and it can only be safely operated in a maximum of 3-foot waves and winds less than approximately 15 miles per hour. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, that's not very rough. I mean, that happens. In the summer, it's more calm, but those aren't real serious conditions by any means. And the U.S. is considering not reinstalling the pier since the aid shipments that it has delivered to Gaza have not been distributed to starving Palestinians. So I think it was on June 20th, they reattached the pier and delivered some aid, but apparently it's just sitting on the beach because the UN's World Food Program suspended distribution of that aid after the Nusret massacre, when Israel launched an attack on the Nusret camp in central Gaza that killed the number now is over 270 Palestinians were killed in that massacre. That was the operation that freed the 4 Israeli hostages. And the UN is investigating whether or not this U.S.-built pier was used in that operation. So on Saturday, the World Food Program announced that it started delivering some of this aid that's been piled up on the beach. But it's basically saying, we're doing this. It's a one-time thing. We're not sure if we're going to be able to deliver aid from the U.S. pier due to the security situation. So just a complete bust, this pier. And aid groups have called it basically a public relations ploy to make it look like the U.S. is doing something, because instead the U.S. could just cut off military aid to Israel and tell them to open border crossings and force them to have a ceasefire if they really care about getting aid into Gaza. But instead, Biden orders this whole ridiculous plan that's cost hundreds of millions of dollars. All right, so the next one here, Israeli officials are hiding data about the forced starvation of Gaza prisoners. This one's from Brett Wilkins. Israeli prison officials are concealing information about reductions in food rations for Palestinians held in the Gaza Strip, where detainees who have also reported horrific abuse, including alleged rape and deadly torture, have been deliberately driven to the point of starvation, according to a report published Thursday. Security sources told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that the Israeli prison service is intentionally cutting Palestinian prisoners' calorie intake, a move confirmed by Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who called the policy a deterrent. Ben-Gvir said, quote, "The Palestinian detainees will receive the minimum rights and the minimum food, and I will ensure that this policy is implemented," end quote. He continued, quote, "There is no starvation, but my policy does call for reducing conditions, including food and calories," end quote. So this is the thing. They say Ben-Gvir is some fringe extremist, but he is in charge of the police. He's in charge of the prisons. And this is what you get. And so these are people, and he's saying it's a deterrent for terrorism, but people can be detained for any, Israel just rounds people up and locks them up. We've seen pictures and videos of young boys being stripped naked and arrested by Israeli forces and thrown into these prisons where they're tortured and being starved like this. Just really horrific stuff. One unidentified security source told Haaretz, quote, "Since the start of the war, there's been a deliberate policy of indiscriminate reduction of food. To put it mildly, this policy has raised factual questions about the figures provided by the prison service to such an extent that it is impossible to get the full picture and to determine whether what is going on is legal at all," end quote. All right, so the next one here, Iran warns Israel of obliterating war in Lebanon. So another thing that's been very concerning that's been happening while I was away is the situation, the tensions with Lebanon. Israeli officials are just threatening to invade. They're doing all the strikes continue. They're trying to destroy basically all the land on the Lebanon border, on the Israel border inside Lebanon. So Iran is warning against this. Iran's mission to the UN has warned Israel that a full-scale attack on Lebanon would result in an obliterating war that could involve all of Iran's allies in the region. The mission wrote on X that it believes Israel's recent threats against Lebanon could be psychological warfare and propaganda, but said that if Israel does, quote, embark on a full-scale military aggression, an obliterating war will ensue. All options, including the full involvement of all resistance fronts, are on the table, end quote. And when they say resistance fronts, that includes that includes Hezbollah, that includes the Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria. So it's not clear if Iran would directly intervene, but it's pretty likely that militants, from Iraq and Syria could go to Lebanon to fight. So the full-scale war. So another thing, a few things that happened while I was gone, the U.S. Reportedly conveyed to Lebanon that it would support Israel against Hezbollah. They claim that they're working to ease tensions, but also saying that if this does happen, we are going to back Israel against Hezbollah in a war in Lebanon. We're going to back Israel against Lebanon. And they're also saying that they can't control Israel, that, we can't stop them from invading is essentially what they're telling Lebanon as well. So again, just very concerning what's happening there. All right, so the next one here, Israel attack kills 3 Hezbollah members in southern Lebanon. This article is from Jason Ditz, about the Hezbollah and Israel strikes across the border. 3 Hezbollah members were killed in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah hit back with a big drone attack and injured 18 Israeli soldiers. And then the next story here, something that Jason wrote up last week. Balloons land in southern Lebanon, warning that the land belongs to Jews. So messages attached to balloons have begun landing in southern Lebanon, demanding that the locals, those not already displaced by the ongoing attacks and looming threat of a large-scale war, evacuate immediately, declaring that the land belongs to Jews. It's not clear who sent the balloons, but the immediate suspicion is on radical settler groups, of course, the same groups that are loudly lobbying Israel not only to invade and occupy Lebanon, but to convert southern Lebanon into another territory of settlements. So we have settler groups saying, let's make settlements in southern Lebanon. Let's expand Israel. And this is something, you have the ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are settlers and who are these types of settlers. They're calling for the invasion of Lebanon because this is what they want. The message did not identify who sent the balloons, but they are written in both Hebrew and Arabic. They landed in villages across southern Lebanon and include a map of Lebanon in the message. So could be part of the plan for Lebanon. But of course, another thing I mentioned in my story that I didn't mention here is that there was a report in Israeli media, and this is something people have been saying for a while, that the Israeli military can't really handle a full-blown war in Lebanon. That's part of the reason why Iran said that they think this is propaganda, Israeli psychological warfare. And that's part of the reason why, though, if they do go ahead with it, they're probably trying to get the U.S. to back them pretty strongly to kind of bail them out. All right, so the next one here, Israel okays Flashpoint West Bank settlements. This article is from Middle East Eye. The Israeli government has approved 5 Flashpoint settlements in the occupied West Bank and imposed additional punitive measures against the Palestine Authority. The decision made Thursday night by the Security Cabinet includes seizing some of the PA's limited civilian authority in the so-called Area B of the West Bank. So this is taking away the limited authority that the PA does have in parts of the West Bank. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who pushed for the move, said that they came in response to PA legal action against Israel at international courts and the recent recognition of Palestine's statehood by 5 European countries. Smotrich said, quote, "These are steps that protect the state of Israel and convey a clear message. We will never establish a terrorist state in the land of Israel," end quote. Smotrich, on top of being the finance minister, he's also a minister in charge of West Bank settlements, in charge of approving settlements like this. So Peace Now, which is an anti-settlement Israeli NGO, said the decision was reckless and that it undermines Israel's security. They said, quote, instead of worrying about the abandoned residents of the South and the North, the settler government gives a prize to criminals at the height of the war to satisfy Smotrich, who is collapsing in the polls, end quote. So the next one here, an Israeli bill would reserve administrative detention for non-Jews. So this is from Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, of course. Israel's Ministerial Committee for Legislation approved a bill on Sunday that would effectively bar administrative detention or detention without trial for Jews, leaving it permissible only for Arabs. So this is detention without trial. People say, this is one thing when you talk about Bethlehem, when you talk about Palestinian Christians living in the birthplace of Jesus, you see the Israel defenders say, oh, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, governs that area. But it's very limited control. And one of the reasons why the people living there are still under Israeli military occupation, besides all the checkpoints that they have to deal with, besides Israel stealing their land to build the wall that goes through parts of Bethlehem. Where was I here? I just think that kind of gets me worked up when I think about that. But anyway, so this law, one of the reasons why they're under military occupation is because any Palestinian living in Bethlehem, living in any of these areas, could just be rounded up by the Israeli military and thrown in jail, for any reason, if they find that there's reasonable grounds that they're, a threat, a security threat. So this new law, this bill that was approved by this committee, it still has a very long way to go before it would become law. It would basically mean that they could only do that to Arabs and not the settlers who are actually terrorists, who terrorize people, who attack them and steal their houses and leave threatening leaflets that say they're going to kill them if they don't leave. So just really goes to show. So between October 7th and May 1st, 10 Jews were put into administrative detention compared to 2,733 Arabs. So obviously, very overwhelmingly used against only Arabs as it is, but this would make it official. All right, so the last story here is the one from Kevin Gostelow, why the U.S. abruptly ended the case against Assange. So please go check that out. Go read our viewpoints. One from Ramsey Baroud, the Al Talina affair. Is Israel heading toward a civil war? One from Catherine Gunn, the British whistleblower, Julian Assange and the continuing threats to journalism. One from Andrew Coburn, in destroying Ukraine's power grid, the Russians are following our lead. One from Robert Kohler, Assange's freedom is also ours to tell the truth. One from Aaron Mate, new evidence the U.S. blocked Ukraine-Russia peace deal. That's another big thing that came out. I think Kyle covered it for us. The New York Times published this whole report about the peace talks that were happening in Istanbul in March and April. That were happening between Russia and Ukraine in March and April of 2023, including the in-person talks in Istanbul, and the fact that there was a peace deal on the table. And that report says that the U.S. told Ukraine, discouraged them from agreeing to that deal. Which should be the scandal. I mean, this is something about WikiLeaks. When we talk about WikiLeaks and what Assange did, imagine like a WikiLeaks style dump of diplomatic cables about, the U.S. and Ukraine and the fact that they, discouraged peace talks, that they wanted this war. I think that could be revealed. We could learn that definitively, through a WikiLeaks style thing. So that's why it's so important. So go check all of that out. I know this episode has gone pretty long since we had some catching up to do. But just the basic things that I always say: if you want to support this show, share it, tell your friends about antiwar.com and all of that. Like, subscribe. I hope the people, I know for a lot of people that listen to this show, it's kind of part of your morning routine. So I hope I didn't take too much time off. I hope I can be part of your morning routine again. I think it's really cool that people, make this a daily, regular thing. And so, I want to talk a little bit about the trip. I am kind of still out of it. We got home Saturday night, so I'm recording this Sunday night just before midnight. We got home late Saturday night, and the flight's there. It's totally crazy. It's not crazy. I mean, obviously, Australia's on the other side of the world, so it's amazing that we can go there. But bringing a 9-month-old baby and a 2.5-year-old on those flights is a crazy thing to do. I kind of felt bad. It's not really fair to them. But my wife is from Australia, and she has family in Australia, so we did it. It was rough. It wasn't, undoable, but it was rough. But they had a lot of fun when they were there, and they met family that they haven't met. And Australia is really great. We stayed in and around Sydney the whole time for the whole 2 weeks, basically. For the Australians who listen, which I think the reason why a lot of Australians listen is because Caitlin Johnstone is always pointing people to my work. And she actually watches this show with her husband, Tim, which is so cool to me. So hello, Caitlin and Tim. But we went, some of the touristy things that we did. We went out to the Blue Mountains, which is really beautiful. We didn't do too much. I mean, we just spent a day like driving out to the country and kind of went over to the overlook, the real touristy area, which was really beautiful. My son, little Dave, the 2-year-old, loved it. He thought it was like the coolest thing ever. We also drove out to Kangaroo Valley because we wanted to see some kangaroos. And we did see some kangaroos from afar. But the coolest thing that we saw, I posted a picture on Instagram, was a wombat. We got like up close to this wombat, and little Dave just went up to him and just went up to it and pet it. And that was amazing. I mean, according to my father-in-law, that's pretty rare. You don't always just see a wombat and be able to pet it in the wild. So that was fun. For a few days we stayed in Sydney, right in the city, like kind of near, the Opera House and Circular Quay, and did museums, and that's really cool. It was kind of exhausting, with the kids, but we had a ton of fun. So it was a really good time. Australia is great. We're probably going to go every year. We might skip next year. We might wait for the kids to be a little older. I think in the future we might go for even longer, and then I would work, there from there. It's one of the benefits of this job is I could do it from anywhere. But we're happy to be home in Virginia. We love our house here so much. But anyway, so anybody has any questions about the trip, feel free to ask me. And I really enjoy the food. The food is just a high quality. Everything in Sydney is just kind of high quality when it comes to food, and the coffee, the cappuccinos are nice. But anyway, so that's it. This is the longest ever episode of this show. So please go about your day, and I will be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.